I never thought my body would be the one to finally betray me. It happened in an instant, in the middle of an ordinary workday. 1 second, I was standing at my desk, sorting through papers, and the next, the room tilted. My chest tightened, and I collapsed onto the cold floor. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights above me sounded like angry insects as everything blurred. A coworker called an ambulance, and before I knew it, I was lying on a gurney in the emergency room, hooked up to machines, listening to the steady beep that reminded me my heart had been pushed too far. The doctors called my son, Jason. They told me later he'd been notified right away, but he never came. Instead, as I scrolled through my phone with shaky fingers, trying to distract myself from the IV needle in my arm, I saw his wife's name flash across the screen. A notification, a tag. For one breathless moment, I thought maybe it was a message of concern. Maybe Melissa had reached out with a kind word while I lay there alone, wishing someone from my family would walk through the door. But when I tapped the screen, what I saw froze me harder than any diagnosis could have. A glossy family photo filled the screen. My son, Jason, smiling wide at the head of my old dining table. Melissa, radiant in the chair that used to be mine. And Chloe, my 12-year-old granddaughter, laughing, caught mid-smile at something out of frame. They were in my home that I had built with decades of sacrifice. Sitting at the table my late husband and I had picked out together, enjoying a meal like it was their kingdom now. And the caption beneath, finally, a day without the drama queen. Family dinners are so much more peaceful. A string of hashtags about blessings and peace, a few laughing emojis from relatives who should have known better. Already dozens of likes. The words sank into me like poison, burning hotter than the pain in my chest. While I lay alone in the emergency room, hooked to monitors and scared of what the doctor might say, my family was celebrating my absence. Not worried, not concerned, celebrating. That night, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit for a long time. The betrayal wasn't new. It had been creeping into my life for years, wearing a mask of politeness and duty. And this post, this public humiliation, was simply the moment when all the masks fell away. As I lay there under the harsh hospital lights, I realized this collapse wasn't just about my body giving out. It was the final push my heart needed to accept what my mind had been trying to ignore. This wasn't sudden. This betrayal had been building for a long time. And to understand how I ended up here alone, excluded, replaced, we have to go back to where it all began. When I think back to where it all began, it always starts with the silence that followed my husband's passing. After more than 35 years together, the house felt unbearably empty. The sound of his laughter, the scrape of his chair against the kitchen floor, even the way he whistled while paying bills, all of it was gone overnight. At 60, I found myself staring at 4 bedrooms that suddenly seemed cavernous, filled with memories I wasn't ready to face. In those early weeks, Jason was attentive. He would stop by after work, sometimes bringing Melissa and Chloe. They would sit with me in the living room, Chloe's small voice cutting through the stillness that had swallowed the house. Melissa offered gentle sympathy, and Jason reassured me that I wouldn't have to go through grief alone. At the time, I thought it was love. I thought it was family rallying together in my darkest moment. It started innocently enough, suggestions meant to sound practical. Jason pointed out that the house was too big for me, that it must feel overwhelming to manage. Melissa added that keeping up with property taxes and maintenance would eventually become a burden. I remember nodding, grateful they cared. When they proposed moving in temporarily, just to help until I figured out what I wanted to do, it felt like a blessing. Chloe could stay in her school district, and I wouldn't have to rattle around the empty halls alone. At first, it was comforting. I rented a small one-bedroom across town, telling myself it was only for a year, maybe 2. The idea of them caring for the house while I had space to grieve seemed reasonable. I held on to the thought that the home was still mine, that I could always return when I was ready. But over time, the small things started to gnaw at me. Mail that used to arrive at my apartment slowed to a trickle, until I realized most of it had been redirected to the old address. Bank statements, investment notices, even insurance papers, they all went to Jason and Melissa's house now. They brushed it off as convenience, telling me they were just trying to help. I wanted to believe them. Then came the belongings. A set of dishes I hadn't seen in months. My husband's favorite armchair replaced by sleek, modern furniture that never felt like us. Even framed photographs disappeared, tucked away somewhere I couldn't find. Whenever I visited, I felt like a guest rather than the woman who had built that home brick by brick with her husband. I told myself it was temporary, that they needed time, that Melissa was right about saving for their own place. But a year stretched into 2, and then into 3. Every time I brought it up, there was another reason they couldn't move: Jason's job instability, Melissa's supposed pregnancy scare, Chloe adjusting to middle school. It was always something, always just enough to quiet my doubts. And yet, deep inside, the unease kept growing. I could feel my place shrinking in their lives. Family dinners no longer included me unless I made the effort. My presence felt tolerated rather than welcomed. The house I had once filled with warmth and laughter no longer belonged to me. Not really. Looking back now, I see it clearly. My generosity hadn't drawn us closer. It had made me invisible. What I had thought was family support was slowly turning into control. Every decision, every detail, every piece of my life was being redirected and reshaped without me even noticing. By the time I realized how much I had lost, it was already too late. And that creeping sense of dread, the feeling that something was very, very wrong, it followed me all the way to the hospital bed. The night I finally collapsed. When the nurse handed me my discharge papers, she asked gently if my son was coming to pick me up. I forced a smile I didn't feel and said I would call a cab. The truth was written all over Melissa's smug social media post. Jason knew where I was. He knew I had been rushed to the emergency room with chest pains, and he chose to sit at the head of my dining table instead. I sat in the hospital lobby, clutching the thin stack of papers, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel fragile. I felt cold. I felt awake. My heart had been pushed to its limit, but my mind was sharper than it had been in a long time. As I waited for the taxi, I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't dialed in 3 years. Barbara, my old real estate agent. The last time we spoke, she told me the house on Maple Street could sell in a week if I ever decided. Back then, I wasn't ready. Back then, I still believed my son's promises about moving out someday. But now I was ready. When Barbara answered, I asked her to come by the next morning. My voice didn't tremble. It surprised even me. That call was the first rebellion, the first brick pulled out of the wall they had built around me. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The bitterness of what I'd seen kept replaying in my mind. Jason laughing, Melissa radiant, Chloe glowing with innocence, and me, lying in a sterile hospital bed like a forgotten afterthought. I opened my laptop and decided to do something I hadn't done in far too long, look at my own financial accounts. What I found made my hands tremble. There were inquiries I didn't recognize, loans I had never taken, credit accounts with balances that didn't make sense. At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake, some clerical error. But as I dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Every suspicious account was tied back to the Maple Street address. My address, redirected into their hands. My stomach churned as I pieced it together. The missing mail, the constant excuses about finances, the way Jason always seemed to know more about my accounts than I did. This wasn't carelessness. It wasn't neglect. It was deliberate. They hadn't just pushed me out of my own home, they had been quietly draining my life while making me thank them for their help. The weight of that realization pressed down on me, heavier than any diagnosis. For years, I had told myself I was being dramatic, that grief made me sensitive, that I was imagining slights where none existed. But there, in the quiet glow of my apartment's lamplight, staring at numbers that didn't belong, I knew the truth. This wasn't about a family growing apart. This was about betrayal, carefully calculated and executed. And something inside me shifted. I was done being the quiet mother who accepted excuses. I was done believing their version of the story. They had underestimated me for the last time. By the time I closed my laptop, my fear had hardened into determination. They wanted me invisible. They wanted me compliant. But I wasn't going to disappear quietly. The battle had just begun. The morning after I called Barbara, my phone began buzzing nonstop. Jason's number appeared first, then Melissa's. When I didn't answer, the messages poured in angry, frantic, dripping with entitlement. Word had reached them that I was planning to sell the house they had claimed as theirs. The house they had reshaped until I barely recognized it. They weren't calling because they were worried about me. They were calling because, for the first time in years, they realized I still had power. I let the phone ring. I sat in my kitchen with a fresh cup of coffee and silence. And for once, I didn't rush to soothe their panic. Instead, I opened my laptop again. I wanted to know just how deep this betrayal went. What I found was worse than I imagined. Credit card statements linked to my name, filled with charges for things I had never touched. Spa treatments, designer clothing, private tennis lessons for Chloe that she had never once mentioned. Thousands poured into restaurants and weekend getaways I had never been invited to. And then the vacation $8,000 spent in December for a resort in Mexico. The same Christmas I spent alone, telling myself they must have needed a quiet holiday. The truth was unbearable. They had abandoned their daughter with friends and flown to paradise, funded with my identity. As I scrolled, the humiliation grew heavier. Melissa's Instagram was a highlight reel of those stolen moments. Photos of perfect family dinners at my table, vacations I never knew about, parties I wasn't invited to. Under each picture, comments praising them for their happy life, and their responses lies. They painted me as fragile, as antisocial, as someone going through things. In the eyes of extended family and friends, they had rewritten me into an unstable burden, an inconvenience to be pitied and ignored. But the worst discovery came not from social media, but from the credit reports my attorney friend pulled. The pattern of mail redirection, the loans I hadn't authorized, the subtle isolation. They weren't random. They were laying the groundwork for something larger. When she explained it, My blood ran cold. Conservatorship. Guardianship. They were preparing to have me declared incompetent. My own son, the boy I had raised, was gathering evidence to argue I was unfit to handle my own life. And Melissa Sharp, manipulative, always watching, was orchestrating it all. Every missed birthday call, every staged photo of me looking tired or confused, every whisper to relatives about my supposed decline, it was part of their case. They weren't just stealing money. They were trying to steal me. Rage burned through the heartbreak. For years, I had convinced myself I was overreacting, that I was lucky to have them close. But this wasn't family care. This was exploitation, dressed up as concern. I closed the files, my hands trembling, but not from fear anymore, from fury. They wanted me erased, tucked away while they enjoyed the life they built from my name. But I wasn't disappearing. Not now. Not ever. If they thought I would roll over quietly, they had underestimated me. This wasn't neglect. This was war. And I was finally ready to fight. It was a Saturday morning when I heard the knock. Soft at first, then more urgent. When I opened the door, there stood Chloe, clutching a suitcase almost as big as she was. Her eyes were swollen, her little shoulders tense, like she had practiced being brave all the way over. She didn't say much at first, just stepped inside and looked around my small apartment with the kind of nervousness a child shouldn't have to carry. I asked where her parents were, but the silence in her face told me everything. It didn't take long before the truth came spilling out. One trembling word at a time. They had left her? While I sat alone over the holidays, convincing myself they were too busy, too tired, too wrapped up in their own lives to call. They had been on a beach in Mexico. And Chloe. She had been dropped off at a friend's house with nothing but a story about sick relatives they supposedly had to care for. She told me how she watched her friends open gifts on Christmas morning while waiting for her parents to come back. They never did. Not until after the vacation was over. My heart cracked wide open listening to her. The lies they had fed me were one thing. The lies they fed their daughter were another. I could forgive myself for being naive, for wanting to believe the best in my own son. But abandoning Chloe, their only child, and making her believe it was normal, that was unforgivable. As she talked, her voice dropped lower, like she was afraid someone might punish her for telling the truth. She admitted she had seen things too, packages arriving, new jewelry for Melissa, new gadgets for Jason, all while being told money was tight. She didn't understand the words fraud or loans, but she knew something was wrong. Children always do. I pulled her close, her head resting against my chest, and in that moment the battle shifted. Until then, it had been about reclaiming my dignity, my home, my name. But now it was about protecting her, this innocent child who had been used as a pawn, lied to, and left behind like luggage when it didn't suit her parents' plans. I looked at her suitcase sitting by the door and felt the weight of it, not just the clothes packed inside, but the unspoken plea. She needed safety. She needed family. She needed someone who wouldn't abandon her. And in that instant, I made a promise. Not to the courts, not to the lawyers, not even to Jason and Melissa. I made it to Chloe. I would not let her be a casualty of their greed. I would fight for her as fiercely as I was fighting for myself, no matter how long it took, no matter how ugly it became. She would know at least one person in her family chose her over convenience, over money, over image. They had crossed every line when they used me, but when they used her, that was the last straw. The weeks that followed felt like a storm I had no choice but to walk into. Only this time, I wasn't walking alone. Barbara, my real estate agent, stood firmly by my side, and Patricia, the attorney she introduced me to, wasted no time pulling together every thread of evidence. What I had stumbled upon in the quiet of my apartment was only the beginning. Once professionals began digging, the full picture emerged, and it was uglier than I had dared to imagine. Every fraudulent loan, every forged signature, every redirected piece of mail they had left a paper trail thick enough to choke on. Investigators traced account after account, all tied to Jason and Melissa, all masked under my name. When Patricia spread the documents across her office table, I felt sick. But I also felt something else for the first time in years: vindication. The betrayal wasn't in my head. I hadn't been dramatic or fragile. I had been preyed upon. And then came the part that nearly broke me. This wasn't their first time. An investigator uncovered records from years earlier, when Jason and Melissa had lived with his elderly Aunt Margaret. She had passed suddenly, and though nothing was ever proven, the financial irregularities in her accounts told the same story: money drained, debts accumulated, all while she declined. The family had brushed it off at the time, writing it up to confusion, age, grief. Now I could see the pattern. I wasn't their first victim. I was just the latest one who fought back. It was both horrifying and strangely empowering. Horrifying because I saw how carefully they had been repeating this cycle, moving from one caretaking situation to the next. Empowering because now we had proof. Their story of being the loving family burdened by a difficult mother was crumbling under the weight of undeniable facts. Court filings came next. Fraud, identity theft, elder abuse. Words that looked sterile and legal on paper, but carried the weight of every sleepless night, every cruel dismissal, every smile Melissa had plastered on her face while planning my erasure. Chloe sat with me during some of those meetings, coloring in the corner of Patricia's office, and I made silent promises over and over that she would never have to face this alone. It wasn't easy. Facing Jason across a courtroom, seeing Melissa whispering in his ear, still trying to twist the narrative, it cut deeper than I can explain. But for once, I wasn't shrinking under their version of events. I had the truth, and I had people who believed me. That made all the difference. By the time the preliminary hearings ended, I knew the tide had turned. They weren't going to silence me. They weren't going to take my house or my name or my freedom. The fight wasn't finished. Not yet. But victory was finally within reach. And as I walked out of the courthouse with Chloe's hand in mine, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, courage steadying me from the inside out. The day the house finally sold, I walked through those empty rooms one last time. The laughter and love my husband and I had built there had been overshadowed by years of manipulation. But as I closed the door behind me, I didn't feel defeated. I felt free. That chapter was over, and I was stepping into a new one, not alone this time, but with Chloe by my side. The courts did what they were supposed to do. Jason and Melissa faced the consequences of their choices. And for once, their excuses and polished social media stories couldn't protect them. It was bittersweet watching my own son fall so far. But it wasn't my shame to carry anymore. They had written their own story. I had simply chosen to stop playing the role they assigned me. Life looks different now. Chloe and I live in a small, cozy house where her laughter fills every corner. She's thriving in school, making friends, and learning what it feels like to be chosen and prioritized. Sometimes I catch her glancing at me with a quiet kind of relief, as if she's still testing whether this safety is real. And every time, I remind her in words and actions that she is home, she is loved, and she will never be left behind again. As for me, I've found peace in giving back. I volunteer with an organization that helps prevent elder abuse, sharing my story with others who need to hear that it's never too late to fight back. That pain I carried for so long has been reshaped into purpose. Looking back, I don't regret standing up for myself. I regret waiting so long to do it. But maybe that's the lesson I was meant to learn, that protecting your dignity is not selfish, and refusing to be a victim is not dramatic. It is necessary. I may have lost years to betrayal, but what I've gained is far greater peace without apology, and the deep satisfaction of knowing I refused to be erased. And if my story has reached you today, I want you to remember something: your voice matters. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. If this touched you, please like, share, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear your story too.